Morning glory and evening grace, America. Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. Welcome. Coming up later in the hour, United States Senator Tom Cotton will join me to review the ongoing operations against the Houthis. But I'm beginning this hour with our friend Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv is the Times of Israel correspondent, the Ask Haviv Anything podcaster, and my go-to guy for figuring out what the heck is going on in Israel. Over the weekend, I read every source that I could and was amazed at what was happening in Israel. So I asked Danielle to please get a hold of Aviv, and he's here. Thank you, Aviv, for answering on short notice.
Thanks for having me, Hugh.
Would you begin by laying out to people what the Supreme Court did, or actually what Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet proposed to do vis-a-vis Shin Bet, and you had Ronen Bar, and you may want to explain what Shin Bet is.
Yeah, the Shabak, or the Shin Bet, is the internal domestic security intelligence service. It's roughly parallel to the FBI, although it does also have near abroad kind of elements. It was supposed to, for example, track Hamas in Gaza. So it extends beyond. But its basic job is to protect Israel against spies, organized crime, things like that. So it's one of the intelligence services of the state, alongside the Mossad, alongside a couple of others. And Ronen Bar is the head of the Shabak, and he was the head of the Shabak on October 7, and so he is also responsible in large part for the failure of October 7. He's one of the main people responsible for that failure. And over the last couple of days, we've seen the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, make public a demand to fire him, and explain to the public in videos that argue that there's actually a conspiracy by Shabak head Ronen Bar to depose him. And Netanyahu has started using the word deep state, borrowing it from the Trump administration, borrowing it from the United States discourse. And so that's all happened in the last week.
So when did Barr take up his duties? Because if I'm correct, he did so under the prior government, led jointly by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, both of whom are enemies of Netanyahu.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, he's been in the he I believe took his in 2021. He came to office in 2021. He I don't know of any opposition to him from Netanyahu or from anyone around Netanyahu. Um, there are a lot of things happening here all at once. One is the claim from Netanyahu that there's a conspiracy. He has a specific argument. It's Netanyahu's response to the claim that, in fact, Netanyahu from the left, that Netanyahu is engaging in a conspiracy to dump all the fault of October 7 on other people and get them fired. And so there's this back and forth where each side is claiming that the other one is conspiring against Israeli democracy, against them, etc. So Ronen Bar is someone who worked closely with Netanyahu, who had there was no tension that we knew of before October 7. Since October 7, you can't get away from the politics of it. I mean, I'm happy to lay out Netanyahu's case, but Netanyahu has systematically gone through and fired people and made the claim that he's the only one in power not responsible for October 7. And so there's definitely, even if there is an actual conspiracy exactly the way Netanyahu is arguing, this is still a very seriously political moment, and Netanyahu is relating to it in very political terms.
Now, there's also a second actor that's sort of an independent actor, your attorney general. Now, I'm not well versed in Israeli law, and I know you haven't got a written constitution, you have the basic law, and the basic law provides for this position of attorney general. But she has struck me for the last 2.5 years as pretty publicity driven and very anti Netanyahu, and I guess she's a holdover from the previous government as well.
Let me take a step back. Let me try and lay out the government's case here, because the government's case, I think, is not stupid. It is serious. It is not merely politics. The Israeli government, the cabinet, the politicians are arguing that Israel's attorney general is, in fact, unusually powerful. It's an extraordinarily powerful position. It is both the legal advisor to the government and also the head of the state prosecution, which means that it both offers legal advice to ministers and also indicts the ministers. Right? This is the same person. That's a conflict of interest. It's a very powerful position also because about 30 years ago, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that if the attorney general tells the government something is illegal, then it's illegal, and the government has to abide by the attorney general's ruling. In other words, that, for example, if the government disagrees with the attorney general and wants to go to the High Court of Justice against the attorney general, limiting the government from taking some action, the attorney general doesn't have to represent the government's opinion, right? Because this official legal advisor of the government was turned into by a Supreme Court decision in a famous case called Deri Pinchasi 30 years ago, a separate kind of judicial oversight of the government. And so I know that sounds crazy, especially in the English speaking world. We have possibly among the most powerful attorneys general in the world. And over the last 2 years, ever since the judicial reform was announced in January 2023 by the justice minister of this government and backed and supported by Netanyahu, and it became something that really set Israel's streets on fire, and half the country was convinced it's the end of democracy. And ever since then, the attorney general, I think, has come to see herself as the child holding the finger in the dike, preventing the flood. And so there's been a lot of this headbutting between the government and the attorney general. The government is allowed to fire the attorney general by law. The government is allowed to fire the head of the Shabak by law. But if the head of the Shabak is right this moment, literally in February, began investigating multiple members of Netanyahu's closest circle, aides in his office, for receiving money from Qatar, the great funder and supporter of Hamas, his firing might look like an attempt to subvert justice. And if she is defending the country from very radical demolition of as the left claims, right, the radical demolition of the Supreme Court's power to balance executive power, then it's a war on democracy. And so the big question really is, what does everybody intend? The right is arguing that the law is on its side, that the court and the attorney general have this runaway power unequaled anywhere in the world. And the left is arguing that the government is trying to demolish any check on its power of any kind. The sad part is that both of them have a lot of data points in their favor. And it's become a debate that's so utterly politicized that this really fundamental and crucial question that Israel has to decide about its constitutional order and its future as a democracy is being handled by the lowest imaginable politics and lack of leadership.
Now, I dove in by listening to Amanda Dan and David Horowitz talk for 35 minutes about this. And at the end of it, all I could conclude is that, and I don't know that it's fair, I hope it is, that both Amanda and David don't like Netanyahu, so they're siding with Ron Barr and the Attorney General. And that to me is an echo of American politics where everything became, where do you stand on Trump? And then I'll tell you what I believe about everything else. In other words, Netanyahu has so polarized the country that we can't get an objective GPS on anything. So, Haviv, if you were going to explain to an American audience right now, do you have a constitutional order or don't you? Because it seems to me you only have a parliamentary system. Netanyahu won, and all these other people are just standing in his way of prosecuting a war.
Okay, so let's leave the prosecuting a war question to the side. I don't think there's anything standing in his way of prosecuting a war except himself. So, but the war, I have a separate critique of Netanyahu. Let's just tackle the constitutional question, and really take a step back. Israel is a parliamentary system, meaning the people elect a parliament, the parliament elects the cabinet, the government, the executive branch. That's true of Britain and Australia and Austria. And the one difference with Israel is that we have almost no checks on that cabinet that other systems have. So, for example, Britain has direct election of MPs. So an MP who's popular in their district can say no to a prime minister from their party, right? So that's a check. The direct election of MP is a popular check on a prime minister's power. Israel doesn't have that. When Israelis go to vote, they only vote for a party list. And the entire country is a single constituency that votes for these lists. And who actually puts a person on the list of a particular party? In almost every case, it's the party leader. In most parties, there are no primaries at all. They don't even pretend. The center left Yesh Atid, the Russian majority Israel Beitenu, the religious parties, they don't even pretend to have a primary. Likud has a primary, but Netanyahu's influence is so enormous in the party that functionally it isn't really a primary. And so, and again, Likud is the best of them. In other words, everyone else is worse. And so, what that means is, just to take all of that Greek and turn it into a simple point, is that Israelis elect parties that elect a cabinet. The people sitting in government, in the cabinet, the executive branch, the ministers of that government, led by the prime minister, have literally personally appointed the parliamentary majority. So, functionally, in Israel, unlike in other parliamentary democracies, the executive and legislative are almost the same. They're literally the same people, appointed by the same people. They are functionally one unit. And that is why, in the Israeli context, the Supreme Court has grown so immensely powerful. And it has, for lawyers in the crowd, unlimited standing, almost unlimited justiciability. The court will deal with any issue. The court will respond to any, it hears 5,000 petitions against different government actions a year. The Supreme Court of Israel, not lower courts, not little functional courts. And so we have this immensely powerful court, but almost no other checks and balances in our system. There's no second house of parliament. There's nothing. And that's the problem. So the Israeli political right says this court has become unbelievably powerful. For example, our Supreme Court has a functional veto power on appointments to itself. There's a 9-member committee that appoints judges. It has representatives of the parliament and the cabinet, and it has representatives of the court. And the 3 members of the court have enough votes to veto an election to the court, because you need 7 out of the 9. And those 3 members of the court have never voted apart in hundreds and hundreds of votes on judges.
Wow.
So the court can veto appointments to itself. Anyone can have standing, and it will tackle almost any issue, including literally battles in mid-battle. I mean, it is a massively powerful court. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, and I'm sorry for going on for so long, but just to catch everyone up on 75 years of Israeli law, constitutional law, the right is absolutely correct that we have a ridiculously and unhealthily powerful court. And the left is absolutely justified in feeling that the attempt to weaken the court is an attempt to take over anything, because there's just no other check in the actual system, except, of course, elections. But elections are, a long time apart. And in the meantime, you can do a lot of damage if there's no real check between parliament and government, etc. So
that would put a premium. That would put a premium on the Supreme Court acting prudently. In other words, as the United States Supreme Court often has, they punt and they don't get involved. They don't like political cases. They don't want to get in the middle of controversy. Sometimes they're obliged to, as in Bush v. Gore, and occasional cases having to do with the executive and the Congress. But they generally don't want to get in the middle of them. They're typically called non-justiciable political questions. The Supreme Court, as I see it from America, the Israeli Supreme Court, seems eager to get in the middle of all this and to always flick the nose of the conservatives who clearly represent the majority of the country.
Yes. First of all, yes. Second of all, no. And I'll tell you why no. In January 2023, Justice Minister Yariv Levin, Netanyahu's justice minister, presented the reform the government was proposing. And the reform of the court was so utterly extreme and radical that what it ended up doing was actually not saying to the court, hey, the government should have more say. The elected officials should have more say in appointing judges, which is totally reasonable. Not telling the court, there should be limits to justiciability or to standing, but actually saying we can completely ignore the court. No matter what you say, we just literally can ignore it. For example, one of the elements of his reform was what they called the 61 vote override. Anything the Supreme Court says, 61 votes in the Knesset can override. Now that's 61 votes out of 120 is the lowest possible majority, which in a parliamentary system, by definition, a coalition government has. And so the government was literally in this reform gutting the court completely. The tragedy of this moment, and the reason that I feel deeply alienated from both right and left, is that what we need is a weaker court and many more checks elsewhere in the system. But we don't have a responsible right. It's correct on its critique of the court, largely. Most of the right is correct. We don't have a responsible right to do that. And you know how you see this playing out? When Yariv Levin proposed his reform, and it's still echoing now, we're seeing another battle in that great war. When he proposed the reform, there was 70% support among the public for judicial reform. A month and a half later, that had fallen to 25%. So the Israeli political right is correct, and most of the public thinks it's correct, and is so radicalized and so irresponsible that most of the Israeli public was convinced by the left, saying they're actually just trampling everything and undermining and destroying everything. The Israeli right is refusing, alongside the absolutely correct weakening of the court, to come in and say, hey, we need new institutions, more checks, but not in an unelected court. And so everyone
But
here is irresponsible, and we don't have the leadership to get this done. And it's a real tragedy.
but there's a war, and so I'm wondering: do you think the Supreme Court will back off and allow the dismissal of the head of the Shin Bet and the dismissal of the Attorney General, if only to turn the page and move forward to try and finish the war and get the hostages out and bring about a new order in the Middle East? Because it seems to me they are displaying a massive indifference to the circumstances on the ground right now.
I think Ronen Bar has to go. Um, I think he has to go. And I think turning him leaving into a political fight serves Netanyahu's need to have an excuse for him not to go. In other words, I am someone who believes that everyone in charge that day. I happen to think Likud's front bench is actually a group of remarkable people. And Netanyahu is not the only leader Israel could possibly have. And everyone was responsible for October 7. His basic theory of containing and deterring Hamas for 15 years is what exploded in our faces on October 7. The military chief lasted way too long, a year and a half. The head of Southern Command of the IDF, the general most closely, the theater commander responsible for October 7, then fought a war in Gaza with all of that guilt on his head. I don't understand how any of that happened. So I think Ronen Bar has to go. He doesn't have to go because of this political, game of chicken with Netanyahu. He has to go because of October 7. But Netanyahu needs another reason to fire him so that people don't say, hey, if October 7 is a fireable offense, why doesn't that apply to Netanyahu himself? And so, there's such an important constitutional question at stake here. And I'm not against the right on this, on the fundamental points, but it has behaved in ways that are so utterly irresponsible and dangerous and silly that they've undermined their own case time and again. And just look at the fact that judicial reform never advanced. It never actually passed.
Will it be back? And I want to go back to the Attorney General as well, because they've tabled a motion to fire her as well, which I imagine the Supreme Court will get involved in as well. And again, I laugh at people who say the United States is in a constitutional crisis because we haven't had one since our Civil War. But this does kind of look like a constitutional crisis from across the ocean. It doesn't seem like there's an agreed upon resolution process. Am I right about that?
Both sides, I think, genuinely believe. I don't know. Some of the politicians are clearly being, very tactical and but I think that both sides genuinely believe that this is a fight for democracy and that they can't afford to lose and that there's a lot at stake and then but as you say, there's a war on. There are now soldiers back in battle in Gaza. They're soldiers of ours who have to face enemies on 7 fronts. Why pick this fight now? That was a choice, and it was a choice of the political class. The attorney general is far too powerful, ridiculously powerful. I'll even say another thing. 15 years ago, I interviewed one of my heroes, who is a man named Amnon Rubinstein. He wrote the Israeli, what is basically the Israeli Bill of Rights, the basic law, human dignity and liberty. He was a dean of a law school. He was one of the education minister, one of the greatest Israelis. And he belonged to the deep left, to the Progressive Meretz Party. And he told me the attorney general is far too powerful. There's a conflict of interest built into the position, and it has to be separated and weakened into 2 weaker positions. And so there is a substantive debate here, a substantive debate where the sides can agree. But it has been so overtaken by politics that it has now become dangerous. And the fact that our political leaders think that they have the luxury of politicking their way through this constitutional question in the middle of this war is to me, forgive me, I don't like saying dramatic things, feels to me like a kind of betrayal. I don't think the attorney general has to stay on the job if she doesn't have the trust of the government. I don't think the government needs to fight it in this way, needs to frame it in this way. You have to convince. Most Israelis don't believe the government is honest in its attempt to weaken the court, but in fact think it's about the power of the executive and expanding it without checks. And if that's true, you need to earn the public's trust first. So go and earn the public's trust. Write a Bill of Rights. Introduce a second House of Parliament. You know, the Danes have an electoral system like ours, single constituency proportional representation system, just like ours. And on the back of the ballot of the party, there's a primary race. In other words, you rank the members. And so that's a check on executive power that we could pass with almost no legal changes. There are so many solutions to earning the public's trust. Netanyahu, back in March of 2023, when this was exploding and he was really scared of the political fallout of the judicial reform, actually said to Israelis in public, we're going to draft a Bill of Rights so that you know that our intentions are good. And that nobody in Likud ever even got to work on one. It was just a little political balloon. Well, get serious.
One
You want
more,
to change the constitutional order,
one
you have to
more
actually do it right.
strange thing that happened this weekend. The president of Israel, Mr. Herzog, got involved. That's like the Queen of England getting involved in a constitutional crisis. Isn't the president of Israel supposed to stay on the sidelines, Haviv?
Yes, the president is supposed to represent all Israelis. It's supposed to be the figurehead that represents us all. What he has said is, he thinks this is fundamental. He thinks democracy is actually at risk. And if you believe that, then that's the great red line. I mean, we will not survive as a country if we're not a democracy. Because, if Israelis think that they're going to some war for some Putin kind of dictator, they're not going to send their kids to the army, right? So that sense of togetherness, of solidarity, is dependent on democracy. This conversation, I don't think Israeli democracy is threatened, but I think it is the political right in the way they have handled themselves that have created the feeling that democracy is threatened. And if we actually, there's no reason to do it now, but if people actually go through in detail the actual proposals of that reform, it really did erase the court, the proposed reform, not anything that ever passed. And so it really was deeply, profoundly ridiculous and irresponsible. I'm arguing that they were being incompetent. It's not hard for someone to make the leap and say, well, what if they weren't being incompetent? What if that was their actual intent, to literally erase the court, the last great check on executive power? So the right is correct and handling itself in a way that is convincing more than half of Israelis that it's at war with democracy. And all of that's a tragedy.
So, what about the response? And I've asked a couple of American Jews what they thought about this, and they're just as completely flummoxed as I am. What about the argument that the entire country is moving to the right? It's going to move even more to the right when this war is concluded. It has been moving throughout the war to the right. And there is an elite that is dug in, including at the Supreme Court and at various media outlets, and they don't want to let go because they think they're entitled to more authority than the people of Israel think they're entitled to. Is that actually happening?
Look, we're talking, I mean, by definition, we're having a conversation that has to reference the American context. Let me tell you something about the Israeli, we'll call them the deep state, okay? The elite bureaucracy that's hard to remove. They're serving in the war. Their children are dying in the war. They're profound patriots. They're not doing it for themselves against anyone else. And every time a government minister comes in and weakens the strong state bureaucracy, things fall apart. We had a minister of police that came in, Itamar Ben-Gvir from the far-right party. He came in and he harumphed and he declared his declarations and he replaced the top brass of the police. Every kind of crime has risen. Every kind. I mean, purse snatching. I don't mean, terror-related crimes, which has risen because of a war. So, we have very powerful functionaries in the Treasury that have made us one of the most balanced, fiscally responsible countries in the world. Our debt to GDP is 60%. Yours is 130%. Okay, so yes, we have a state bureaucracy, and yes, it's quite strong, and yes, sometimes it's dug in. It's also one of our greatest strengths, and You want to replace it? You should replace it. The elected officials should win on policy fights with the bureaucracy. Absolutely. But they're doing it in ways that are so ham-fisted and so incompetent, and they're driving weaknesses. They're taking one of the country's great strengths. Our left, our political left, Hugh, serves in the military in its vast majority. I don't know if your political left does that. Our state bureaucracy is sending children to fight in the wars. So to take American discourse about this, where there really is a kind of class war that I don't understand enough to comment on, and just apply it to Israel, which Netanyahu likes to do and tries to do all the time, is simply not true. If we lose that elite, that serving elite in our government, we will look a lot less like this astonishing success story and a lot more like the countries that failed in places like Latin America.
So let me switch that larger political conversation, and there's no answer there because we don't know what they're going to do, to the war. Israel has resumed the war. It's had devastating success again in removing a half dozen of the senior Hamas leaders who are left. I assume that it will have success on the ground as the ground troops reoccupy Gaza in a powerful way. What impact on the war, if any, is this political debate and constitutional debate having?
I don't think it's having any impact on the war whatsoever, with the exception that its soldiers are walking into a battlefield knowing that everyone is bickering about other things, which is not a great thing for them to think and not a great thing for them to know. You want them to think that the people making the decisions about the war aren't looking at the political clock and aren't fighting political fights, especially related to the war. So the head of the Shin Bet is the guy who's most responsible for getting them the intelligence in real time for the battlefield. And the prime minister is the guy responsible for deciding the biggest aspects of the war. Those two people should not be fighting while the soldiers are in harm's way. So it's having a morale effect for sure. And I've heard that from a family, a relative of mine who has now been called up. He's not in yet, but he's going to go in. But it's not actually affecting, as far as I can tell, the actual decisions in the war itself.
Okay, my last question, Haviv. What is the mood generally? I see 100,000 people demonstrating. There are 10 million Israelis. I don't know if that's big, little, small. I don't know if the anger in the streets is like it was in America in the summer of 2020. How do you assess the mood in Israel right now and whether or not it is sufficient to support a successful war effort?
Uh, the great challenge is trust. I think that the one thing that most Israelis agree on, some Israelis side with Netanyahu, some Israelis don't. I suspect it's about 50-50. I have not seen a poll in the last 2 days since the crisis has really exploded. But I have to tell you, we have polls from last week that tell us that 70% of Israelis want Netanyahu to go. About half of those 70, about 35-40% want him to go now. About half want him to go, another 35%, in other words, want him to go immediately after the war. But they think he should step down, right along with Ronen Bar, the head of the army who has already gone, and the head of Southern Command who has already gone, and all of that. So the sense that there is a lack of trust in the leadership from October 7 is absolutely there and palpable in the Likud ranks. In other words, it's not just a question of the left. And I'll tell you one other thing: the markets have responded.
Oh,
Yesterday was the biggest fall in the Israeli stock market since October 2023. And it's not because of the war. It's because of the sense that there's once again chaos in the legal system, chaos in the political system. It's the sense that there isn't a responsible adult in the room with their hand on the till.
a question from history. Does anyone in Israel ever say, it's probably better if I just left the scene, like the Attorney General or the Prime Minister or the head of Shin Bet or the Supreme Court judge? Does anyone ever say, you know what, I'm doing more harm than good here?
There used to be such people. In 1973, after the 73 debacle, the war was prosecuted fairly well, but the fact that the Egyptians and Syrians surprised us was a catastrophic failure of intelligence, of the political leadership. And Golda Meir won re-election. The war was in October 73. Golda Meir won re-election in December. And immediately after winning re-election, there were mass protests against her, even though she just won re-election. And the protesters said, you oversaw this failure. You have to go. And Golda Meir resigned. There was a period in Israeli history where our leadership felt shame. That period is long gone, and I don't just mean Netanyahu. Barak keeps trying to come back. A whole new generation of Israeli politicians has a lot less shame and a lot less likely to go just because they failed at something.
Haviv Rettig Gur, thank you for that update. It's awfully confusing watching from afar, and I appreciate your taking a half hour of your time today to fill up the American audience with some perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh.